Okay, so I gotta share my screen. There we go. Okay, cool. As usual, I'm just going to go through this. There's some different examples, and we're going to talk about a couple new concepts that will be useful as you guys are starting to build out your games a little bit. If you do have questions, feel free to just talk and ask those questions, or use the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as usual. But anyway, the things we're talking about today are emergence and progression, and these are two very, very important concepts when it comes to game design. They're a little bit more sort of like high-level concepts. So we've talked about lots of different concepts in the past when it comes to level design, techniques, things like goals, obstacles, and rewards. Emergence and progression are two different ways of thinking about designing a game that have more to do with this sort of like larger abstract thinking of how games work. We'll talk about these two different concepts and how they're different, how they relate. Most games today kind of involve aspects of both of these design styles, but we'll go over how they work. So emergence and progression are two aspects of creating systems for gameplay. Emergence refers to the creation of very simple rules with open-ended results. Progression is an order of predefined challenges. Okay, so most video games, as I mentioned, use both of these concepts in different components of their design. But the way that you design those two different things is very different. So we'll talk about emergence first and give some examples of emergent gameplay. Emergence is, as I mentioned, simple rules that add up to a game experience. So games like chess, or in video games The Sims, are both very good examples of emergence. We have a set of rules, and that set of rules is used by the players to create the gameplay. So the game designer doesn't have like a specific set of events that's going to occur like they would in a progressive game, or a film or a narrative story. The game designer instead comes up with different roles and different rules and a board and different parameters that make up the game world, and then the players create the experience or the arc of the game through their understanding of those rules. So here's The Sims. So in The Sims, there's no real beginning or ending point. You're just, you have rules about how the world works, and you're just building the world and then seeing what happens based on the decisions that you make. So simple rules are combined into complex systems, and each gameplay will be different from previous games. So with emergent style games, it's usually games that are harder to master. So chess is a really good example for this one, where the rules are actually very simple. You can learn the basic rules very quickly, but to be really good at chess, you have to play it a million times. Like you have to play it over and over again and learn how those rules play out over time. Let's see. Okay. So if you're designing an emergent game, you're going to come up with some rules and then play through and see what are the effects of different changes or adding or subtracting different rules from the overall gameplay. So when you're designing an emergent game, you have to spend a lot of time actually playing the game, playing with other players, watching how the game develops with different concepts or different rules implemented. And then you might make very small tweaks to how those rules fit together to come up with the gameplay. Games of emergence, one way that you can know that a game is an emergent game versus a progressive game is if it has a strategy guide instead of a walkthrough. So like a strategy guide will give you kind of hints and tips about how to strategize to play the game. But there is no one way to play the game. There's no one ending. There's no one specific way that the game is meant to be played. So really good example. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. So in a lot of open world games, you have a combination of the two where you can kind of make different choices. So the designer actually has to have both of those things in mind. Like the player may choose to play in one style versus another, and they may choose to start in one end of the map versus the other end of the map. But a lot of open world games also have narrative to them, like they have a, you know, specific events that are eventually going to occur during your playthrough. So yeah, that's a good example of a combination of the two. And as I mentioned, most games that you might play today are going to have some combination of both emergent and progressive play styles. So the Pokemon strategy guide is a good example of a strategy guide. Anybody who has played Pokemon knows that there's like a huge number of different variations and different possibilities for how the game works. So there are progressive aspects to Pokemon. For example, there are like narrative arcs, and there's like a number of things that can be collected and things like that. But the main gameplay, the main sort of functionality of the battles between the Pokemons have to do with this huge sort of variety of possible actions. And so rather than having a walkthrough that just says, you know, go here, go here, go here, instead what you have is a strategy guide that kind of goes over the different types of characters and the different strengths and weaknesses and how you might start to strategize to have a good attack or defense or approach to your game. So let's keep going. I'm gonna check the chat real quick. Okay. Hi Marvin, no worries. Okay. So in a emergent game, a playthrough is typically very short. So chess could be really long, but you know, compared to playing like a really long narrative game, a game of chess usually would be pretty short. Other games, like if you're playing a round of Fortnite or another kind of battle royale type game, if you're playing other esports types games like Rocket League or something like that, the actual game itself is very short. You might play for 8 hours, but you're playing rounds of the game, and each time you play a round, you're kind of like trying out different strategies, learning different skills, or repeating or rehearsing the skills that you've picked up. So in an emergent game, a playthrough is typically short. There are exceptions to that, something like Civilization that plays out over a very long period of time with lots of different kind of moving parts and different strategies. Something like, you know, in board games, some board games take a really long time, like Risk or Settlers of Catan or Monopoly, things like that. They may take a really long time, but they're going to have a session and then you're going to repeat that session. It's not like a narrative game where you might play once or twice, but once you've played through the game, you know, a few times, you're probably not going to want to play it again. And emerging games are also more likely to have an audience. So we can see here the Overwatch finals in the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. We have this like massive audience, like it's a huge concert. You're not necessarily going to get that for emergent games where you know, somebody who's playing it may be at like a very specific point. Of course, there are, you know, there is an audience for like Twitch streamers or YouTube videos of more emergent games if you want to watch the narrative or the gameplay of a game. But typically with emergent games, there's going to be more likely there's going to be an audience. So again, things like esports, things like chess, there's an audience watching because it's more similar to a game that is, you know, like a game of soccer or a game of tennis or something like that. It's more about the competition and the strategy between the players than necessarily like the narrative or the progression of the game. So those are a few aspects of how we might recognize an emergent game, and then we can think about how goals and obstacles and rewards work. So in an emergent game, the goals might be a little less clear than in a progressive game, where typically the goal is just to, you know, beat the game to get to the final boss. In an emergent game, the goals are often formed by the individual players rather than being set by the designers. So the designers may come up with some basic rules, but players may set goals for themselves. Like, I want to score this many points, or I want to play really good defense, or I want to have this specific type of character. In an emergent game, the goal is for the outcome of the game to be greater than the sum of its parts, if you guys have heard that term before. So you come up with a few rules, but the combination of those rules is what makes the game really fun. So the game designers, instead of creating specific goals, like you have to get to the castle or you have to beat the final boss, they'll create winning conditions. And so these are conditions that are likely to happen, which will either have some players lose or have some players win. So for example, in Monopoly, the conditions are set up so that it's likely that all of the other players will go bankrupt, and that will leave one player who still has money. But that doesn't always happen, and anybody who's played Monopoly knows that a lot of those games are never actually finished, because if there's a balance of the different game mechanics and the players have a good balance of strategy and skill, they may never actually reach that conclusion in a reasonable amount of time. Here we just see the Monopoly board, and you can see the components of an emergent game. There's a small game space with very specific rules. There's specific tiles, there's a specific type of currency, and then there's specific rules about how the players can use the currency and the rules of that game world. So some of the challenges or obstacles in emergent games, computer-based emergent systems have to have some way of keeping the player involved. And so of course there's a long history of computers that play different games like chess, and of course we often play emergent games not against other players but against the computer. So typically in an emergent game you're going to play against somebody else. Like if you're that Overwatch team, you're playing against another Overwatch team. If you're playing Mario Kart, usually you're going to be playing with your friends together or with other people. And so there are aspects of the way that that video games work that manage those sort of emergent qualities. So one of the biggest examples of this that you guys have probably heard of or talked about before is the rubber banding in Mario Kart, which is used, that sort of design is used in a lot of other games. And that happens in a couple of different ways. So one of the ways that happens in Mario Kart is if you're behind, a lot of the weapons that you can use in Mario Kart, like shooting the turtles, are going to attack the people who are in front of you. So by being behind, even though you're supposed to be ahead to win the game, being behind gives you some other advantages that help keep the sort of play balanced. But people have also written and documented how there's other aspects of rubber banding that happens that isn't visible to the player. So for example, if you are playing against the computer, depending on how well you are doing, it will affect the speed of the other players. This is from an article about this where you see a chart of the average speed of the players going around a course in Mario Kart. And if you play, what happens in the sort of test is that if you play badly on purpose, you'll see that the other players are not as fast. And there's a big history of this in video games, of people basically figuring out the AI of a game. Old games like Mario Kart, Pac-Man have a lot of history of this, of people trying to figure out exactly what the AI is doing and then use that as part of the strategy. So that's another aspect of emergent gameplay that may not be part of the rules, but may be baked into how the AI or other components of the game system work. So as I mentioned, challenges are usually built around interactions with other players. So they typically require either a multiplayer system or a sophisticated AI or computer system that can imitate human action or human behavior. Within that system, there are sort of desirable and undesirable effects of that emergent gameplay. And so you want to kind of balance that so you have obviously more desirable effects. So undesirable effects is if the AI is too obvious, if it's too obvious to the players how to kind of beat the AI or strategize the AI, then that will have unintended consequences and also could have unintended advantages for certain players. So when you're playing a game, there's this sort of like rules level of stuff, but then there's also players who are trying to beat the game designer rather than the player that they're playing against by figuring out how to kind of glitch the system or exploit things that the game designer has not accounted for. So that happens in video games, obviously not in board games that don't have those AI systems. Another thing that is specific to emergent games is internal economies and social rewards that are outside of the game. So Really good example of this is something like in Fortnite, you have skins that you can buy with money or win, and that becomes this sort of like meta part of what's happening in the game where you have challenges, but the rewards are not necessarily winning the game, but there's also these other components that are social, especially with networked or online games, or are just currencies that the game world creates for itself. So those are some of the specifics of how emergent games work. We'll look at progression a little bit with some other game examples. Any questions before we continue? Joshua, oh yeah, so you said like the N64 Mario Kart speed runs. Yeah, so that's a really good example. So that's not as much of a competition within the game, but again, this sort of like social competition. Like if you're a speed runner, you're not competing with the challenges of the game so much as you are with the speeds or times of other speedrunners. And so that is an example where a lot of speedrunners might use, specific software or try to find parts where they can exploit flaws or unintended consequences of the game developer's design. So yeah, speedrunning is a good example of this sort of component of emergent games that exists outside of the game world itself. Okay, let's talk about progression a little bit. So this is King's Quest. I don't know if you guys have played this game. It's pretty old. It was one of my favorite games when I was a kid. I played it on floppy disks on my old family's computer. But you can see this is a good example of progression because we just see all these scenes and how they fit together, and everything is kind of predetermined. So with this game, you can choose the order in which you arrive at these scenes, right? You can see that this map allows for vertical and horizontal movement across these scenes, but all of these scenes are predetermined. And your path through the scenes may change, but the ultimate goal of the game is part of this progressive narrative experience. So in a progressive game, you have levels or stages that control how the player progresses through the game. So again, in contrast to emergent games, you might have different types of levels in an emergent game. Like in Rocket League, you have 2-on-2 and 3-on-3 and 4-on-4, but you don't really have stages that go through that game. You just play one and then you play the same game again. In a progressive game, you have levels that kind of get increasingly more difficult or create more complexity as you play through the game. In most progressive games, the fiction of the game world is enhanced by and sort of intertwined with the progression design. And narrative in game space is expressed spatially rather than temporally. So like we saw with King's Quest, you progress through the space rather than over the time like you would in a book or a film. Undertale is a very good game, a good example of a game that has progressive qualities. This is a clip from the intro sort of narrative, and there's an ending that you will eventually get to, and there's a lot of narrative and decisions and different things that happen in between. Undertale also has a lot of emergent qualities because there's battles and things that happen that require strategy and other emergent gameplay types, but the overall experience has levels and it has progress that you go through the game. Progressive games are more reliant on what we kind of think of as modern video game platform distribution stuff because you have to have all of these things predefined. So one of the examples that we've talked about a bunch is Rogue and how that kind of got around the problem of distribution of a limited amount of data by having procedurally generated levels. And so that's kind of an emergent aspect of how Rogue works. It feels like a progressive game because there are levels, but there's this also emergent component of there's playthroughs and strategies, and you'll play it more like an emergent game than a progressive game. Progressive games tend to be much larger because the levels are designed very specifically, so we have to save all that data in order for it to look the same on everybody's computer. And progressive games tend to have walkthroughs that show you how to get through each component of the game. So it's going to be the same for each player. Last of Us is a good example of a progressive game where there's lots of long narrative scenes. You can watch it almost like a movie. I've never actually played it, but I've watched lots of it on YouTube. And so the progressive components of the game are something that other people could watch just for that narrative and sort of entertainment experience. Progressive games tend to be single player, but can involve multiplayer elements. Gameplay is expected to be longer, and usually you only play through once. You might play through a couple times if it's your favorite game, but a lot of games, once you've played through it and seen everything, that's everything that you need to do. And typically they're easier to learn. If your game is more about story and narrative and progressing through the game, you might rely on more typical game mechanics that players are already used to. So a lot of progressive games are like first-person shooters or RPGs, these styles that we all have kind of played. And so you don't have to reteach somebody the rules in a progressive game. They already know how to play. The design focuses more on the story and the level design and the events that the player will go through. Again, this is just typically, this isn't all progressive games, but this is typically how what we would see. So we can use emergence and progression together, and we can use these two concepts as we're designing a game. And as I mentioned a bunch of times, almost all games involve components of both of these things. So progression can be used in complex game systems in emergent games. So we can use like a tutorial is an example of progressive design. So if you have a game like something like Overwatch or Fortnite or something like that, typically there's going to be some kind of tutorial or onboarding that teaches the player how to use the different mechanics in the game. And that's an example of progressive design because there's a series of steps that the player has to go through. So it's a simple one, but it is an example of progressive design used in a mostly emergent game. Progress is also used as a resource for emergent games, like if you get through a bunch of parts of the game or if you play a certain number of times, you'll get access to new components of the game. So that's another way that we can use progressive design with an emergent game system. And we talked a little bit, Gal brought up open world games earlier. That's sort of related to what I'm talking about now, the way that we combine these things. So games can be designed so characters have freedom, but they are likely, so we're kind of designing probabilities that they're likely to encounter different components of the progressive game design as they play. Things like the story or different achievements within the game. We want the gameplay and the progressive parts to be balanced, so the player doesn't lose track of making progress or not learn the game mechanics. So when we're creating a game, we kind of have to keep all of these things in mind. We don't want to spend 10 hours teaching somebody rules to play a game that they're only going to play for 11 hours. On the other hand, we don't want to have the player lose track of what's going on or never sort of make different levels of achievement within the game. Okay, so those are the two concepts. Hopefully that basically makes sense. I think most of you guys are probably familiar with both styles of gameplay. You might have a preference. You might prefer more competitive esports type games. You might prefer more narrative RPG type games. But you've probably played both, and you've probably seen these concepts used in game design in lots of different examples. Let me check the chat. Running away is a very good strategy in Undertale. Yes, true. So there's a few resources here to read more about progression and emergence. This article is an academic article that kind of talks about the difference between emergence and progression. It's not super long. It's got some good examples in here and its own references as well. This one is another kind of short article about using emergence and progression in RPG design. And then this one is a longer academic article, which is actually, I think, very good in terms of talking about the concepts in general and then combining them together when you're designing a game. And there's some cool little graphics that kind of explain what they're talking about in terms of thinking about game design. So I think those references are all really good if you want to read more about this. But I think that is it for our lecture. Any questions on either of those concepts?